The Enigma of Me. Last night I was listening to the new album by an Australian artist by the name of Peter Garrett. Peter was, or maybe is, the lead singer of the band Midnight Oil, who were big in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I'm not sure whether they are still together as a band. This is Peter's second solo album. Midnight Oil songs were all highly politically charged, touching on issues such as the impact of mining, climate change, corporate greed, indigenous issues, and so on. I was wondering, before I listened to Peter's latest solo album, whether it would continue in this vein, or perhaps become somewhat more personal and introspective. Many of the tracks do continue to broach these political topics, though perhaps in a slightly less abrasive way. But one track in particular stood out for me, the final track on the album, called Everybody. In this song, Peter is very clearly reflecting on the later years of life and the approach of death. There are still occasional political references. For example, everybody should lay weapons down, everybody should lay weapons down. But many of the lyrics are much more personal and introspective, concerned less with what's going on out there than with what's going on in here. He sings, for instance, I find myself asking, could I have done more? I find myself asking, should I have done more? And with respect to the approaching end of life, everybody tries to freeze time when they're called. Everybody tries to squeeze time when they're called. In those moments we have left, no point in weighing those regrets. Everybody's got to make time when they're called. As I was listening to these words, I experienced something of an epiphany. It helped to explain why I was never quite moved by the lyrics of Midnight Oil songs. Let me go back in time a little to unpack this epiphany. When I was younger, particularly in my late 20s and through my 30s, I was a very political animal. I ran twice for election in Parliament, once in the federal government and once in the South Australian state government. Needless to say, I was not successful. While I was doing my theological training, I became very interested in a branch, or perhaps maybe a style, of theology called liberation theology. This was a highly political theological movement, particularly within the Roman Catholic Church, and originating mostly in Latin America. During the 1970s and 1980s in particular, Latin America was particularly volatile, with liberation and revolutionary movements abounding. Some elements of the church were heavily involved in these revolutionary movements, even while most of the hierarchy of the church remained on the side of the establishment. They had a lot to lose, after all. But there were even priests who took up arms and or participated in revolutionary governments if and when they were established. The theology of this movement drew as much upon Marxist ideas as it did upon biblical sources and the church's tradition, although naturally they managed to find support for their ideas in both of these. So for me, in those early days, Christianity was very much a call to action, and specifically to political action, rather than just to isolated acts of charity. I was still an Anglican priest when I stood for election. But something changed for me. Or perhaps rather I went back to something that was more fundamental to my nature. Because you see, despite my overt political intentions and actions, and despite my intellectual recognition of and acknowledgement of the importance of these issues, my heart was never quite in it. I didn't feel the passion that many people obviously feel in this regard. And that's why, I think, I didn't respond emotionally and passionately to the music of Midnight Oil. My heart wasn't in it. So where was my heart? To understand that, I'd have to take you back even earlier in my life. Even back in high school, in my teenage years, I was strongly drawn to literature. Not thrillers or legal dramas or crime fiction, though I have nothing against those forms of literature. I was drawn rather to the great psychological dramas of literature, to writers such as Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and D.H. Lawrence. Of course, politics plays a role in many of these books, particularly in the Russian classics, but it was the psychological dramas to which I was drawn. I was drawn to what was going on inside the hearts and minds of the characters. And I'm sure this is largely because, for my whole life, I have struggled to understand what's going on within me. This also ties in with what I identify as the mystical streak that runs through me. So even while I was evoking liberation theology, what actually moved me was the mystical streak within Christianity and Judaism and Islam. For example, I was deeply moved by the writing of Nikos Kazantzakis, the Greek writer, and particularly by his novels The Last Temptation, which is about the last temptation of Christ as he hung on the cross, and St. Francis. Both of these novels are profound and sometimes quite disturbing meditations on the inner life of Jesus on the one hand and St. Francis of Assisi on the other. Although I could acknowledge with my mind the importance of political issues, it was and is the inner life that sees my heart. This was and is where my passion lies. Perhaps this is suggested by the very fact that passion is important to me. Why? Why am I drawn to this inner life? Because I'm a mystery to myself. Everything I say and do emerges from this mystery, this enigma, which is me. Of course, I acknowledge that what has created me, my history, my education, my socialization, is at least largely external to myself. But all of my experiences and all of my actions are filtered by or mediated by the mystery that is me. I look at world events. I look, for example, at what's happening in Gaza today and what happens again and again throughout human history. And all of it emerges from or is mediated by the enigma of other creatures just like me. I have this unshakable conviction that to really understand what is going on in the human world out there, I have to understand what this is and what that is, that other enigma watching me right now. I think this explains a great deal about my taste in literature, in cinema, and in music. It's why, for instance, I'm drawn to the romantic poets. The things that move me, that connect with my passion, are the things that look deeply into what is going on the inside, in here, in there. This is why I can acknowledge intellectually these lines from Peter Garrett's song, Everybody, namely, everybody should lay weapons down. Everybody should lay weapons down. I get it. I really do. And I admire those, like Peter, for whom this was and is a passion. But what actually moves me, what connects with my heart, are the lines, everybody tries to freeze time when they're called. Everybody tries to squeeze time when they're called. In those moments we have left, no point in weighing those regrets. Everybody's got to make time when they're called. I know I'll never actually solve this enigma, but does that make my quest futile? No. No more than the fact that people will never lay down their weapons makes Peter Garrett's mission futile. In fact, we're on the same side here. For me, though, the mission is to understand the why of that. Why don't people lay down their weapons? Rightly or wrongly, I feel that the answer to that question lies in here.